Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel. We have a big and important topic today that, honestly, as a sector, we don't always know how to effectively engage on. So I am very pleased to moderate this panel and hopefully gain deeper insights on how we can overcome living income challenges together. Indeed, reaching a living income for cocoa farmers is at the heart of a sustainable value chain. Yet this is extremely complex and requires deep understanding of its drivers to be able to steer coordinated action along the value chain. As an industry member, I'm honored to moderate this panel of experts and critical stakeholders, since we all know that something else needs to happen, yet it seems complex to do it right. Therefore, I hope that in this hour we will be able to bring greater insight on the topic, and in particular on how, as a sector, we can work better together and move through this jointly to see the impact that we need at scale without negative fallout. So we will start with two speakers who each will bring their insights and learnings for about 5 minutes, after which we will have a panel discussion and we have time for Q&A that I think you can drop your questions in the chat. So having said all of this, let's jump in with Yuka. You see maybe I'll first present who's on the panel. Well, one new news is we were supposed to have Alex Asanvo on the panel, who is the executive secretary of the initiative Cacao Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. But unfortunately, he had a last-minute change of plan and will not be able to make it on the panel. But I have some statements that, if we have time, I can voice over. Then also we have Anthony Fountain. Anthony no longer needs introductions, but for those who may not know him, he's the managing director of the Voice Network and co-author of the Cocoa Barometer, and has been advocating a sustainable cocoa sector for more than a decade. Then we welcome Anna Laven, a social scientist with probably 15 years of experience in research and advisory services in sustainable development. And last but not least, Yuka Waarts, who is senior researcher for sustainable value chain development at Wageningen University and Research. And we will move to Yuka straight away for her presentations. Yuka's key topic of research is evaluating the impact of policies, innovations, and interventions on tree crop commodities, smallholder farm livelihoods. And actually, as she was mentioning, today she published a new paper co-authored with Manuel Kivish that is called Balancing the Living Income Challenge, as a follow-up to the No Silver Bullet paper that was published last year. But Yuka, I'm handing over to you now for your 5 minutes of sharing insights.
Thank you very much. Could the slide, which is currently on, be... Yeah, thank you very much. I can share my screen. Let's see. Sorry for this slide technical challenge. Yes, so today we will shortly discuss our sort of more than a decade-long research on smallholder farmer incomes and livelihoods by addressing the question how to achieve a living income for all smallholder cocoa farmers. And I start with the basic statistics from our research, which is also confirmed by other reports, which is basically that about a third of the farmers or less earns a living income in cocoa. So we say actually nearly 75% of the farmers are not earning a living income. And based on the analysis in the report, which you can find if all goes well in the chat, we conclude that actually 1/3 of the farmers actually cannot achieve a living income from cocoa specifically without structural change. And the root causes we find in our research are, for instance, small farms leading to low volumes, not necessarily for all small farms, but generally speaking. Furthermore, there is an inability to invest of a lot of farmers. So the majority of the farmers has difficulty to invest enough to have high yields, which again leads to low volumes produced. And then prices are unstable and unremunerative, and there's a tendency for oversupply. And this is an important element of the discussion, I would say, because also there are a lot of assumptions that simply raising the prices or doubling the prices will will be the solution. While we find that if you increase the incomes of all the farmers with 50%, actually still the majority of the farmers will not earn a living income. So that's quite a significant realization, basically, because the poorest farmers benefit the least because they have the lowest volumes. And then finally, normally speaking, if you cannot earn a sufficient income from one income source, you could try to find other income sources. And there we see that there's few other options to actually significant improve incomes. And there's labor stickiness, which is a term for people who are not generally easily moving elsewhere for work. This leads us to sort of visualize what the pathways would be for different types of farmers. And as I already told you, we see a large proportion of farmers not earning a living income currently, and also about 1/3 of the farmers who we don't think they can actually make it with cocoa. And basically they need different types of support. So specifically the poorest and the most vulnerable farmers need a totally different approach to improving incomes than, for instance, the higher performing farmers, the relatively richer farmers. So we identify here different types of support pathways for different types of farmers, which I would like to discuss in more detail, but I'm happy if you can grasp at least the difference between the two different groups. And one thing which also adds to what Justin Adams said earlier in the session is really we see opportunities for also connecting the social agenda, so the living income ambitions, with the net zero and forest protection targets, which could really play a role if done well. And then finally, we draw conclusions on sort of who could do what specifically. And I'm not pointing at private sector, CSOs, government, because basically I think the key conclusion is that because of the variability and the different types of poverty drivers, basically we need to work together to address the living income challenge. I think that's the key sort of conclusion. Without better and more collaboration, we will not have living incomes at scale. So to the left, well, discuss with farmers, because I think still farmers are underrepresented, even though there's a lot of efforts to keep them involved, working together. I already mentioned that. Also in implementation, sharing data and information together. We know there's tons of data in the sector, and we know that they can be really well used for policy design and intervention design. So we keep, well, trying to inspire people to share data and subtract the value of the already existing data. Then tailor-made support, which is a link to what Anna will be saying in the next 5 minutes. Obviously, there's issues around pricing, but I would like to point to the need for supply management, because simply increasing the prices at scale will have negative effects, result in oversupply. I already mentioned the payments for ecosystem services, but also very important to mention is the policy side, which is supply management, land governance, social protection, and employment. And with that, I conclude my presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yuka. And just before I hand over to Anna, we will come back. We have the opportunity to come back with some questions at the panel moment. And I really appreciate your link between the human rights side, or the poverty side, and potentially the climate side, which is something that also came up strongly at the COP26 for the first time, I thought. Anyway, very happy to move to Anna. Now, are you ready? Do you have some slides? There you go. So Anna, you will tell us a little bit more about your experience with segmentation and potential pathways for achieving a living income. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. So yeah, I would like to take 5 minutes, which is very short, to share some of the lessons from an independent kid study commissioned by Nestlé, where we take a segmentation approach to identify living income strategies. So why a segmentation approach? Well, basically we know that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to a living income, and we believe it can help to cater for specific needs of different households and develop tailored strategies that are likely to be more effective. So what we've learned throughout the study is that there are a number of determinants of household income, also mentioned already by Yuka. And some of those are not surprising. We know that they have an impact on income, but some of them are also less on the radar. For example, marital status, although maybe obvious, we have not heard so much about it, but if you are actually a couple, it does become easier to pool labor, to diversify your income, and to increase yields, just to set that as an example. And what our determinants confirm is that living income is a household concept. And we believe that only a gender-sensitive approach will help to develop living income interventions that benefit all household members and that help to unleash their potential. So we took indeed a segmentation approach, and we took a number of steps I would like to take you through briefly. First of all, we learned from Nestlé's elite program that gave us input for a clustering exercise and a segmentation exercise. We did a data-driven clustering exercise among 12,000 households using 4 different data sets based on a number of key characteristics. And what emerged is that there are actually 5 reoccurring clusters, which means that no matter which data set, these clusters come up as groups that you can distinguish. And that actually suggests a level of robustness. And what it gave us as researchers confidence is that these clusters are also in a way intuitive. They follow kind of life stages, which makes it understandable that these different groups actually turn up. The biggest group are the cocoa-dependent households, but we also have a group of what we call diversified households. These are also cocoa growing households, but they relatively produce more other crops or have other sources of income, which also leads actually to higher total income. We also see a very interesting group of younger, ambitious farmers with a relatively high level of education, often small land size, high dependence on cocoa, a high locus of control. But these households, although they are very eager, they are less able and they miss basically the resources to get started. We also saw 2 outliers, the arrived seniors. These are the wealthier farmers, large land sizes, income diversification, and often involve older farmers like 55 plus. And we have the female farmers, which are known to be a more vulnerable group. They are the poorest. They often represent single-headed households, small land sizes, average yields, and very low income. So what we try to do, and this is a big step to take, is from this more theoretical exercise go into segments that are really easy identifiable in practice. Because if you cannot identify segments in practice, it will not work. So as we were looking with Nestlé for high potential segments, we decided to remove the outliers and to include 2 different groups of who we knew they were also promising. One was the aspirational elite. We learned from the elite program that they were doing well, they were very eager to do well, and they already had quite some success. And we looked at the female entrepreneurs, as these are often co-founding wives, but overlooked in existing data sets. So what we've done to identify these groups, we used existing channels. So for example, aspirational elite are already identifiable because they're registered as elite farmers. But we also used very simple indicators like age, marital status, and education level to identify people basically on the spot. And that worked really well. And we had extensive fieldwork to dive deeper into these different segments and really dive into the aspirations, the needs and opportunities of these different groups. And that allowed us then to reach our goal, which was to identify potential pathways for these different segments to match interventions with their needs. On this last slide, it's just a snapshot, but it's basically an example of how such a potential pathway could look like. This is an example for the young, single, and ambitious group. What it comes down to, that the starting point is that you need to have a good understanding of the needs and aspirations of that particular segment, what makes them unique. Then within your sphere of influence as a company or as a partner, you can identify an entry point which makes sense, which is an entry point that actually the group is waiting for. In our case, the young, single, and ambitious farmers, they really said, we want to be part of this elite program because they saw the change that other farmers went through. So this could be an entry point to also give this group access to such a program. Of course, you need to take into account enabling factors. An enabling factor in this case is the availability of a good coach that really challenges the farmer and that really helps the farmer to make good decisions and to take ownership of his decisions. We then foresee from that entry point a kind of route where starting with cocoa, there will be also capital available to start investing in non-cocoa income. And also the coaching can help there, and also the training on income diversification. Then if you look at the red box, this was something that the young, single, ambitious, often male farmers pointed us to. They said, we want to be successful in life so we can settle down and get married. We want to marry, we want to have children, but we want to be ready. And such a life event, marriage, is of course not something the industry can influence, but it does provide an opportunity to also respond to that. And for example, when a couple is married, to also offer a training to the couple and helping them, for example, to develop a joint household vision. And that could be a kind of accelerator to make even a more effective pool of resources available. And lastly, it's also about this type of pathway. It's an incremental pathway. It's really about the longer term, and it requires a level of responsiveness. So this is just an example. There's much more to say, but yeah, we do hope that this can be inspiring, but also provide a kind of new lens on how you can look at pathways and opportunities that empower people and that match both the needs of the sector and the commitment of the sector with the needs of the people on the ground. Thank you. These were my 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much, Hannah. Well, let's dive into panel. I think there are some questions coming in. We will tackle them towards the end of our slot. So I don't think I think it's confirmed we don't have Alex, right? Okay, so in which case, Anthony, let's go to you because we haven't heard you yet, and I guess you have been listening carefully to the young ladies' insights and learning. So what are your thoughts overall on what you heard? And, you know, are there farmers who can never earn a living income from cocoa farming? And if so, what can be done to ensure inclusiveness and success for these farmers? Or if not, you know, what are the essential elements a strategy should include to make this possible? What needs to be done differently?
Thanks so much, Kathy. I think a lot of building blocks have already been given in the past hour and a half since we started this conference. But before we go into that, I just want to say how welcome and important the kind of studies are that Yuka and Anna have done. I mean, when we started first looking and discussing the issue of poverty as the driver of all of these challenges, as Artie also mentioned in the opening session, you know, about a decade ago, we started publishing about this, and we said, guys, we need to look at the poverty issue. But the biggest challenge we had at the time was there was simply no data at all to talk about these issues. And so we started from very rough assumptions based on what was there. And so, you know, it's really much better to navigate these waters with increasingly accurate maps, so to speak. And so I think kind of the work that Anna and Yuka are doing here is just essential. But I also think that Yuka mentioned something that's really essential in this as well. And that is that, you know, without structural change, people are going to be left behind. And I think that that's where the conversation needs to be about. How do we then get the structural change so that people don't get left behind? Because we are not going to accept the idea, oh, a third of the farmers won't be able to be helped, so we're just going to leave them on the side for now because our strategies are going to go for the early wins that we can actually positively do, and we're not going to focus on the hard work. That's not what Yuka is saying, but that is what I am hearing from people in the sector that are saying, oh, we need to focus our energies on where we're going to actually have the most effect. And that kind of business thinking often gets in the way of the human rights thinking, where you say, no, you're responsible for everybody in your supply chain. And how are you going to make sure that you don't leave the most vulnerable, the most poor, the most desperately needing your help? How are you going to make sure that they're not going to be left behind? Because this is my concern when we start segmenting, that in business speak, they become the victims of the professionalization drive. And I think we really need to watch that. And I think that, you know, Anna mentioned a few things, Yuka did as well, and Artie as well, in what are the building blocks in making sure this does not happen. And I think gender is the first building block there. In all of the studies, we see that the households that struggle the hardest to get there are often female-led households. And so step one is to look at gender equality. There's a role for government there. There's a role for industry there. There's a role for men there. There's a role for women there. We all need to get to work to make sure that this gender conversation goes from being something that we put as a side event into the key building blocks of the beginning of every problem analysis and the beginning of every strategy we bring forward. I think the second thing that we need to look at as well, when we look about the structural change, is look at how does the market work? How does the market remunerate farmers? And I think that to that extent, the last 2 years, the living income differential, the work that the governments in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana have done to start trying to raise the price is an important first step, but we are nowhere near where we need to be. We need to understand how pricing works. We need to understand how the markets work. So what does this do on the futures market? What does this do on the commodities market? How can companies take their responsibility and make sure farmers are paid enough without hiding behind the market? But also, how can governments play a positive role in driving up the price by putting in place, for example, supply management strategies that are still completely non-existent, right? So we need to put in place all of these things. And then lastly, we need to understand this is a development issue. As Anna rightly pointed out, living income is a household concept. Growing cocoa is a business concept, and there is an overlap between those two, but it's not the same circle. It's a Venn diagram that overlaps, but is not the same thing. And so we're also going to have to find ways, how do we approach this from a household perspective? Now, and I can spend another hour or two talking about this, and I know that we're in slow, we don't have a lot of time there, but I think it is really important that we cannot say, let's just leave that third of the farmers that can't be helped behind. And I know that there's a lot of business people in this call, and I know that that's your first response. I know that that's the business thinking there. Let's go for the ones that we can help. And that would be a fundamental dereliction of your human rights responsibilities. We need to look at ways how we get everybody on board from a business perspective and from a government perspective.
Thank you, Anthony. And it sparks a question that I want to ask to Yuka, maybe, or Anna, also feel free to jump in. I hear you on the segmentation and the 30%. And the question I would have maybe for Yuka So what is it that can be done? Because I think you're right, Anthony, that that is a business thinking. But I think some businesses are maybe also thinking, well, maybe there is only that much that I can go to a certain level, but other elements need to come in. So is that part of your thinking, Yuka? Like, what else can be done for those for who it will be really difficult through cocoa alone?
Well, yes, definitely. There's a few options. A lot of people are experimenting and working on on-farm diversification. That's one. Though what we see in research is that generally favors the already better performing farmers because they have more land and more money to invest. Except for food security type of interventions, which can really support food and nutrition security of the poorest households. But you also have to specifically look beyond cocoa, so off-farm income, employment, and social protection or cash transfers, because basically there's such a large group of farmers with very small farm sizes, the inability to invest. There's no other way, I would say, than to do that. So you have to look beyond the farm and to see how you can support these farmers building up their resilience.
And maybe I can add.
Yes, I was going to ask Anna.
Thank you. Yes, so thanks, Yuka. I also wanted to refer to the cash transfers. I think there have been a number of studies already that particularly for more vulnerable households, cash transfers help. I've learned that unconditional cash transfers help well for the poorest households, and conditional cash transfers help actually more to really change behavior. So they are both very interesting instruments. I know the sector is also already looking into those different innovative ways to give income a boost, or to take barriers to avoid that people need to take a loan, and instead they can use the money to invest and avoid any additional costs, for example. So these things are happening. I also think that the segmentation approach in itself is not good or bad. It can help you to understand better differences, and depending on your prioritization, you can also serve with that knowledge different groups of farmers. I agree with Anthony that a lot of people are still left out. I think there's enormous knowledge gap, and Yuka, your work with Manuel Kiwis has contributed to filling the gap already to some extent, that we do not know enough about, for example, sharecroppers, the lives of people who live more remote in hamlets, who are doing large part of the work but are not visible. And so there will be a next group of people that will need to become more on the radar, and that in that sense it's a journey that we are on together.
Yes, absolutely. And I wanted to ask Alex in his new role a little bit more about, okay, what are the thoughts concretely? How could we collaborate or form a coalition more concretely between the governments and the industry, the different actors, all the way up to the consumer, probably, to really, tackle those human rights issues that are not necessarily always driven by cocoa and not solvable by cocoa, and where more needs to happen. I don't know if anybody has a concrete example, maybe not, and that wasn't really in the planned questions, but if anybody has an idea of how that could concretely take form, or, is that something that we see the governments lead and drive, inclusive of all the other actors? Any thoughts on that from, yeah?
So if I can just quickly jump in there, I think to some extent cocoa has been a key driver in this, definitely in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. I think we shouldn't underplay the key role that this commodity has had in specifically those two countries. In many other cocoa growing countries, cocoa is one of the many supply chain commodities, products that are being grown. But in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, you go to those places and they say cocoa is Ghana and Ghana is cocoa. And the same thing goes in Cote d'Ivoire. So right there, yes, there is a real tie into, for the past 50, 60 years, between cocoa and the national economy of those countries, especially especially if you then also consider the role of the IMF and the World Bank in the late 70s and early 80s, driving these countries to much more cash crop commodity exporting in order to finance their institutional development, I think it is unright to say, oh, it's more than that. No, actually, for those two countries, really, they're so deeply interwoven. We have to look at how they tie in together. I think if you then take that issue and realize that this farmer poverty is something that's been going on for at least 3-4 decades. And for the last decade or so, this has become something that's becoming more and more prominent. And I think that we're getting to the point that we're now realizing you can't just walk away from the poorest of the poor farmers. You can't just abdicate your responsibility there. Taking your responsibility as companies and as governments is not to kick the poor people out of your supply chain, but to make sure they are no longer poor. And that should be the challenge. And so we shouldn't just clean up our supply chain. We should solve the problem for the poor people. That's where the challenge lies. And there's a really important role for governments there, not just in, for example, the lid or making sure that you drive the prices up or supply management, though that is part of it. I think another really important part of it is to make sure that you have holistic rural development policies that look at how do you develop the whole community, the whole region that is there. That also ties into what Artie was saying in the opening session, that you can't solve these issues if there aren't good schools, if there's not good hospital and healthcare, if there's no clean drinking water, if there are no roads, no access to market, no literacy, no education. All of these things are necessary. And for that, to be honest, we need governments, but governments can only do that if they have enough income. And for that, companies also play an important role. And too often I hear, oh yes, but the taxation in country is really high. I'm like, so you don't want to build the schools, but you want a free school provided by someone where you're not paying taxes? I think taxation is a really important part of this that requires transparency. Really happy to see Justin also mention that. But yeah, kind of at some point you need to start bringing in everything and the kitchen sink, and it becomes a very boring panel because everybody agrees with everybody. But where it becomes complex is where we stop pointing the finger at the other and saying, this is what we need to do better. And I think that's where the big challenge lies now for everyone. So what are the companies going to do differently? Now they have the data that Yuka and Anna are bringing them out. Is this actually going to fundamentally change your approach in your program, or do you just pick out the stuff that kind of further confirms the stuff you were already doing? The same thing goes for governments. How are you going to change your policies, or is this just confirming what you're already doing? And I think that's the real challenge that we're facing at the moment. And the question is whether we're going to get there through the lenses of cameras, or whether we actually need to start seeing and smelling and feeling each other in person again in order for
that's for sure
to get running.
That's for sure. That would be a really good thing. Yes, no, and yeah, the thing is, how are we going to make that happen? How are we going to? We talk about working together, and now we have enough data to understand what are the drivers and who can play. So now it's about creating that platform where we can actually, you know, openly discuss and unfold all the different roles. So that's probably something we need to be working on. One quickly related question, Yuka and Anna, I don't know if you have looked into that specifically, but do you believe that do you have a view on whether the upcoming regulations, like in the EU, UK, could be leveraged more to help farmers achieve higher incomes? Have you looked at that specifically?
A little bit. And to be honest, but I'm not fully sort of informed on all the strategies. What I see is that I'm always a bit afraid that the new legislation creates a paper tiger, because there's always room for I don't say that people would be dishonestly submitting reports, but the question is really, will it actually make a big difference, or will it be a bureaucratic monitoring system? And that's where I think it's I would say an incentive for people to think through really well their strategies and how they can play a role. So in that sense, I see it as a positive note, but without sort of real ambitions to drive change from the different parties. I'm afraid there's always room to be, well, creative or flexible, or so that's my concern, to be honest. It depends what people do with it rather than the tool itself.
Right. Okay, but that's a good note. Good. If we are in the consumer space, I have a question about. We find the platform. We can work together on this. We can understand. We now know a little bit better the segmentation, the drivers, how we can start. Who can help who get to the level where we are reaching human rights. Now, thinking of that and then going back all the way to the consumer, and I don't know, anybody who wants to answer can answer. Anthony, I had a question for you, so more than happy for you to answer, but if everybody wants to build. So what do you think about claims that achieve, the protection of human rights in the short term? A little bit going into what you were saying, Yuka, I think, on due diligence. Claims that are saying we're achieving a living income for all farmers by 2030. Is that something realistic? Is it creating specific expectations in the short term? Do we need to think about a balance? What's the balance between short and long term? I don't know, Yuka, if you seem to be nodding, but Anna, Anthony, feel free.
I think Anthony just unmuted.
Oh, Anthony, go for it.
If others want to add to this as well, feel free. I think we often tend to overestimate the amount of change that is possible in a year, but we underestimate the amount of change we can bring about in a decade. So I think the first question is not necessarily whether or not commitments are good or bad, but it is whether or not our ambitions are ambitious enough for the next 10 years. And I think if you want to do that, then you actually can start achieving a lot. John F. Kennedy, when he said we're going to put a man on the moon, he didn't say within the next 12 months, he said by the end of the decade. And that often is a much more realistic time frame. And I actually think it is possible. And if it's not possible in cocoa, then it's just, not going to happen anywhere. It doesn't mean that it's easy, but it means that we've got the ingredients that we need here in order to move forward. We don't have an insane amount of governments that need to agree on this. We don't have an insane amount of companies that need to agree on this. Cocoa, and that is very unique to cocoa, and most other tropical commodities don't work this way, but cocoa is almost exclusively an export crop. There's virtually no domestic consumption, which is something that the producer governments are trying to change, but at the moment we're at the point where it only gets exported, right? So you don't have kind of the supply chain part that goes away because it's for internal consumption. It really is all of the ingredients are there for us to do it. But what really needs to happen is that people are going to be willing to change how they do things rather than saying, but the other needs to go first. So it's like this big cosmic game of chicken, who's going to blink first? And I think that we really need to get to the point where we're willing to step across that. Now, just one point around the regulatory aspect. I don't believe that consumers are going to make the big change, because consumers, generally speaking, once they walk into the store, their wallet is the main driver, especially in a year where we're seeing massive inflation, etc. That's not going to make a big difference, And the reason why we haven't solved the problems that we're facing and that we've been facing in the 16 years that have been in cocoa now is we didn't have to. There was nothing that made us do it. We're often wanting to do it because it's the right thing to do, but there's no compulsion. And I think that regulations and rules are going to help drive the conversation forward. We've seen that happen on a lot of things. Seat belts, or kind of in the Netherlands, the use of plastic bags in supermarkets. The minute you make it obligatory, the behavior of consumers change, and that's where kind of citizens make a big difference, because they vote for the parties that will put in regulation. So I really believe in the role of citizens, not so much of consumers. And sure, there'll always be loopholes, but good rules is better than no rules. So
right. And then thank you, Anthony. And then maybe probably the last one, Anna, Yuka, because you have similar work done. So I'm hearing Anthony say, yes, we can do this. All a living income by 2030, yet you are putting data on the table that is showing different patterns. So how do we balance between, is there a way to balance, to get, to seek alignment and to balance short-term and long-term Do you have a view on that?
Maybe I can
Sure.
step in. I think I was also thinking about it when Anthony, when you spoke. Like, I think I'm also. Let's forget a little bit about the consumers in that sense. So just going back, we are mainly talking to ourselves, right? The industry is mainly talking to themselves and to convey each other about what we do. And let's not oversimplify things, because even then Yuka and I have presented data and we are more than willing to share, and also with our partners we put our data in the public domain. It doesn't mean that it's all so simple, and I think for me it's really about learning, piloting, sharing, learning, trying, doing, that type of mechanism that we should all embrace to move forward, because it is not simple. I don't think we already know what are the best strategies for everyone, particularly not for the most vulnerable groups. So we are not there yet, but the good thing is we are committed. There is a commitment and everybody wants to move forward. And now with the data and with piloting and investing, we are trying to make it work. But that is a bit the zone I'm in. I think Yuka, I assume you're in that same zone, but I would be curious to hear you as well.
Yeah, I think I would agree. Also, because there's a lot of energy for people to drive change, right? Which I really like compared to quite some time ago. People see the urgency. Then the question is how, and I'm a very practical person. So basically I would say sit together, and then also together based on sort of a trust basis, right? So not sort of someone in the room who's pointed the finger at. So sit together from a trust basis and talk to each other to see how, based on a territorial approach or a national approach or a regional approach, you can address the challenges together and who would have which role. And then still, even it's very difficult, because what we see is also the most poor and vulnerable households are in the same communities as richer and better performing households, right? So it's not something you can point at an area, you can say, well, you are the most vulnerable, we're going to do A. So it's a bit of a jigsaw, that's a bit of an underestimation, obviously. But I feel the energy, and we have the data and the information to really get very far from my perspective, even though it remains complex. So I'm really happy to work on this together with you. And as Wageningen, we also created, we have, created an ambition to do so in the next years. So in that sense, look forward to pick that up together.
Absolutely. And I think, the whole partnership meeting is really around that whole topic. So it would be fantastic if at the end of tomorrow, where, we wrap up, we would have, something concrete that we can start working with. Because I think we all know that we need to accelerate. And I agree with you, Yuka, and everybody probably on the energy that is available right now is really interesting. So,
can I add to that? Because I think Yuka is exactly right. We need to sit together, we need to do these things. But I think the point there is that it means that we need to be open for all of the aspects that are on the menu. And I think too often we've cherry picked those 2 or 3 topics that we like and that we think are the right way forward. And if I can make a parallel, in the Netherlands where I live, there's a huge discussion on how to handle the COVID pandemic. And this person says testing, and that person says vaccines, and that person says social distancing. But the question is, you need to have all of these protection layers, every single one of them, because together collectively they make this complete story. And the same thing goes with tackling poverty. I mean, there's really nobody out there that says if we just raise the price, that'll solve all the problems. But we do need to raise the price, and that is a part of solving the problems. And I think, but the other thing is, yes, we also need the community development. Yes, we need the traceability. Yes, we need the supply management. Yes, we need all of these things. But too often we tend to want to just look at the things that fit our nice strategy already, but we're going to have to be very willing to be humble and open our strategy to other suggestions.
Absolutely. And I think the 2 pieces of work that were presented today, and indeed, the paper has been published, Yuka's paper has been published today, and that's exactly, I mean, it's really looking at the different aspects. So yeah, one big call to action would be create a platform, and that may be a really nice opportunity also for the further partnership, WCF partnership, to think about what is that platform. Q&A. We have one Q&A, and Anthony, you started talking a little bit. Sorry, we have one question. I meant from Ferdi van Heerden, where he asks whether you have a view on the link between traceability and living income. And Anthony, let me maybe first quickly go to the ladies, because we've heard you. Yuka, Anna, do you have a point of view on the link between traceability and reaching a living income, or even the possibility? And if not,
I mean, so very general, they're part of the same thing, right? You need to, in order to trace back, for example, premiums or cash transfers, or you need a traceability system or transparency in place to understand if things are going in the right direction, to understand if things are effective, to understand if you have to steer towards another way of doing things. So in that sense, yes, and probably they can also both benefit from digitalization. So they also, maybe the solution is also in that sense common. So I see different linkages, but I didn't give it any particular thought. So I'm happy to pass over the floor.
But what
it's
I'm
also connected to, to know your supplier, right? Or know the people who are in the supply chain. I think that's the biggest thing that comes to my mind. So whom are you sourcing from, and how are they doing, basically? Even though you can do a lot of other things with traceability, but
right.
Anthony?
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from both of you is
in one sentence, you cannot be sustainable in your indirect supply chain. Full stop.
We will quote you, Anthony, on that.
Is that all, Anthony?
I said it was going to be one sentence.
So, Yuka, at the very beginning, when you gave your speech, there was a question from the room. I was going to say the audience. How do we use supply management to ensure farmers of living income?
Well, maybe in a historical perspective, because supply management has been running. Right. So at the end of the 80s, it was stopped in the International Cocoa Agreement. It's all in our paper. And actually, it was effective in driving up the prices. So basically, how it works in one sentence, maybe a bit longer than yours, Anthony, is basically governments agree with each other how much cocoa they produce. And there's a lot of intricacies there. And they change sort of their yearly production quotas based on sort of market demand, such that the prices are relatively stable and stay within a price band, right? So it's stabilizing the prices, not necessarily having one flat price every time or everywhere, but it's stabilizing prices and ensuring higher prices because of that, because of the supply management.
Right, thank you, Yuka. There was also one question quickly for you. It was a little bit specific, but I will give it the space. I don't exactly know where the question is coming from, but the person says research has proven that 16 to 25 bags can be harvested on 1 acre farm if proper gaps are practiced. So I think that all smallholder farmers can earn a living income if gap is applied.
Very nice one, because we see a huge yield gap, right? So the maximum what you see in the data and on experimental station is pretty high, but the reality is different. So what we see is that there's obviously some farms have different agroclimatic circumstances. So some are producing in rather marginal areas and others are in good conditions, but it really depends also on what you can actually do on the farm. That has to do with labor. So do you have enough people to actually work the farm and be professional, but as well as investments? So is there enough money to actually buy the fertilizer next to sort of applying the fertilizer at the right time, etc.? So there's a lot of knowledge also involved, but specifically the inability to invest and labor challenges are relating to low yields and a quite large yield gap.
Great.
Can I ask you maybe something, Yuka? If we talk about balancing supply and demand, and we talk about all the attempts for sustainable intensification and to increase productivity levels as one of the main ways to achieve also an income. How do you see that? Because it comes down to the same thing, right? You increase production, and in that sense, you ultimately might risk oversupply. How do you see that?
True. Well, and here alternatives come into play. So basically, I know it's a bit sensitive, but basically, if you really ensure that a certain supply is stabilized or at least connected to demand, there may not be a room to grow. So what do you do? So it's also an ethical issue, right? So if you don't allow farmers to improve their yields, because otherwise there will be oversupply. So that's quite a big question in how do you organize this? Who is allowed to improve their yields? But perhaps there will also be farmers who are not sort of, to put it mildly, it doesn't make sense for them to grow cocoa. Even though they may choose to do so, and I'm not doing any saying about removing people from the cocoa sector, even though you hear that sometimes. But it makes sense from a global perspective to really take into account that some people may be doing something else to ensure that supply and demand is matched, but also for the wider sort of development strategy.
Yeah, and
this is where the rural development strategy becomes really important. You need governments to have proper policies saying what do we want in a broader thing. But I think also this is where environmental protection and agroforestry starts playing a role, and diversified incomes and all those things. However, these increased yields also come with significantly increased costs. And though a lot of the arguments around yield increase are around the kind of the additional income it generates, very often there's a big gap in the data or in the comments around it for how much does it cost to get there. And I think that far too often is overlooked. A few years ago, I was in Ecuador at a farm that they were growing 2,700 kilos per hectare, which is, I mean, ridiculously impressive. And someone I was there with, someone from Mars, actually, he asked, and so what's your break-even point? What do you need to actually grow in order to kind of break even? He said, well, about 2,600 kilos per hectare. And so kind of, if you increase the yield, just as much as that it costs to actually increase the yield, then you're not solving the farmer poverty problem. What you're solving is the long-term stable supply at a cheap rate for the multinationals, which is also, you know, it can be a solution, but it doesn't solve the poverty problem for the farmer. So to me, it solves the poverty problem if there's a net income positive effect there. And I think
so to wrap it up then, Anthony, let's turn it around. I'm gonna give away the 5 minutes of closing because I think Kim Frankovich had a really good question that I want to give some space. We only have a few minutes left, guys, but so imagine that we have a space where we sit together and we open our minds, Anthony, as you were asking, to all aspects, and we bring everybody under the tent that can potentially play a role. And if you look at your time horizon, and I'm asking also the questions to Yuka and Anna, like what would be the immediate building blocks we have or need to establish first, and then build on the additional layers to reach the vision? Like, is there a roadmap, and do you have ideas of what would be the urgent, immediate building blocks, whether we have them or not yet, and then the ones that continue to build longer term? Maybe as a closing framework for all of you.
I mean, I will not try to put a roadmap on the table, but I would like to re-emphasize the household approach and then the gender sensitive household approach as a first step. And I've been also working with Mars a lot lately and still ongoing on gender equality. And I really believe it is an accelerator for living income. So that is, I think, one of the first things we could do to have such an integrated approach. And maybe Yuka or Anthony, you can pull the next building block on the table.
And we should be back. I hope you heard Anna's note. And Yuka, you wanted to add another building block.
Yeah, the question on what to do sort of urgently at the first step. Policy processes take a long time. So I think there are two things. There's some very practical things which you can do as individual companies, which you can start immediately tomorrow, I would say. That's pretty easy to say, but they really exist. And then there's sort of the policy process side, where I think they should be addressed quite immediately. So that's my 5 cents.
Because they take time.
They take a long time before, for instance, supply management may take years before it takes into effect.
Right.
And the same with other policy change, such as land governance. So that's urgent to immediately address those, so those policy processes can start rolling.
Great. And Anthony, you will get the last word. I think you already mentioned gender and the supply management systems, and looking at household level, because these are development issues. But anything else, a building block?
Two key things. I think we've not mentioned yet how important it is to bring farmers and local communities into this conversation from the beginning at the problem analysis phase, and not just ask their approval on a plan once it's been finished, right? Let's get the people that for whom this is a daily lived experience into the conversation at the beginning, rather than once we've solved this top down. I think that's a key in moving this forward. And the second thing is we need to get people together away from the cameras, away from all of the posturing and positioning, and we need to get people together in order to be willing to actually work through what is a very complex problem, and that will require us to be humble and to be willing to listen to the other and to be willing to change what we are doing, and we need to be willing to bring everything to the table.
Thank you so much. I think we're having some difficulty, so I'm going to go fast. I think that was, I'd rather hear you give your closing remarks, and I think they were great. Thank you so much to all of you. I think the slides, as requested previously, will be shared. And I think Yuka also published the report. So thank you and have a fantastic partnership. All the best.